Hey everyone, just a quick note. The interview segment of this episode was recorded before Ed fixed the ghost in the machine problem that was haunting his computer, so you might notice some slight crackling now and then during the interview, but it's nothing that can't be ignored and it's still very listenable. Just thought I would mention it because I know that you guys expect, nay demand, perfection. On this episode, Ed chats with an actual economist who helps us answer the question, is Thailand a poor country?
So if you're curious about what makes a country poor or how you define it, and how Thailand compares with other countries around the world, you'll love this episode of the Bangkok Podcast.
Sawadee krap and welcome to the Bangkok Podcast. My name is Greg Jorgensen, a Canadian who came to Thailand in 2001 just in time to see Lord of the Rings in the cinema, and I've spent years looking for my precious. But I found him in my dear co-host, Ed the Truth Knuth.
Wow. And I'm Ed Knuth, an American who came to Thailand on a one-year teaching contract 19 years ago, fell in love with the vagaries and idiosyncrasies of the Thai bureaucracy, and I've never left.
Man, that's like the Minotaur's maze. You need to take a ball of yarn in with you when you go.
That's exactly right.
All right, we want to say a quick thank you to one of our patrons, Mark Fukuda, who supports us at the show shout-out level. Stick around after we're done talking to an economist about Thailand to hear why Mark might have followed in the footsteps of one of Don Johnson's least appreciated, but much loved, by me anyway, television characters. So before we get into it, a huge thanks to all of our patrons like Mark who support the show. Patrons get a whole bunch of cool stuff, including our regular show a day early, behind-the-scenes photos and videos of our interviews, discounts on swag, which you can find on our website, and various other things that aren't available to regular listeners. But best of all, patrons also get an unscripted, uncensored bonus episode every week where we riff on current events and random topics. We just finished recording this week's bonus show, and it was all about updates. Updates on the coronavirus news, updates to Thailand's law on reproductive rights, updates to Thailand's law on foreigners checking in if they leave their house for 24 hours, and an update by Ed on the infuriating process of dealing with Thai bureaucracy. To become a patron and get all that good stuff, head to bangkokpodcast.com/support.
On this episode, I got a chance to sit down with my old friend Dan Honig, who is an assistant professor at Johns Hopkins University in the School of Advanced International Studies. Dan is essentially a development guy. He's well-versed in both economics and politics. I would call him an expert on the issue of economic development, especially in developing countries, undeveloped countries in Africa. But he happens to know a lot about Thailand because he lived here for several years, and I met him here. And we talk about this question of whether Thailand actually is a poor country or not, and if it's not a poor country, then what is it? So without further ado, my interview with Professor Dan Honig. Okay, I want to welcome to the Bangkok Podcast Mr. Dan Honig, or I should say Professor Dan Honig, PhD. He is the Assistant Professor of International Development at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. And I have a connection to Dan, although he's quite an expert. I actually knew him before that when he was just a great guy. Now he's a great guy and an expert. But I knew him probably about 15 years ago when Dan was living here in Bangkok. We worked together at the same company for a while, and we became friends. We stayed in touch, and I have him on the show today to talk about Thailand, in particular, Thailand's level of economic development. In general, when I was thinking about this interview, I had this general question in mind of whether or not Thailand is a poor country or a rich country or a middle-income country. And it turns out this is more or less Dan's expertise. So welcome, Dan. You can introduce yourself to our viewers and maybe tell us about your background.
Yeah, thanks, Ed. It's great to be here. Thanks for the kind words. First, let me say that I am not sure if I am an expert on anything at all, right? I'm definitely not an expert on Thailand, though I do speak some of the language. I'm doing research here now, etc. But, I am happy to talk about kind of development writ large and, sort of where Thailand fits in a little bit. In terms of my background, I first came here fresh out of undergrad. I had, lived overseas and done development work for a couple years before I finished undergrad. But then I, came here, worked for an NGO for a while, and then bounced around. And, it's awesome to be back in the region. And it's also awesome to see, the community you and Greg have built here via the show.
Thank you.
To see Bangkok podcast and you guys.
Yeah, we're blowing up. We are blowing up.
Yeah, I mean, people say Bangkok podcast, best podcast with the word Bangkok in it, hosted by one Canadian dude and a dude from Cleveland in the world.
That's right. I think in that group of hundreds or thousands of podcasts, I think we're clearly leaders
and best to our shared University of Michigan connection right
That's
there.
right. I'm going to make you get a little more specific because I think that your life post Thailand was kind of fascinating. So from Thailand, you went to East Timor. Can you tell everyone what you did in East Timor? Because I think it's kind of interesting.
Yeah, sure. So I ended up going to East Timor because basically I'd been involved in sort of an effort to start a new program here in Thailand, and then some things had changed after the tsunami in late 2004, and we had kind of like a little bit of money dedicated to this project, and so basically I ended up moving to East Timor through a result of kind of like a bunch of sort of fluky situations. Met somebody who wanted to start a program there, started talking to them about design, etc., and ultimately took a little bit of money that was dedicated to this project and saw what we could get started there in 2015. And so, basically what ended up happening is that working with a Timorese co-founder, ended up starting a little NGO that focused on giving young people sort of opportunities to use what was in their heads, their ideas, to make their own lives better. We talked about it a lot, about kind of shifting from learned helplessness to learned helpfulness, figuring out that what you think about the world and what you think you can do can improve your life.
Cool. I remember back in the day being in touch with you there, and I know that nonprofit work and development work, you can kind of do well while you're doing good, but I just wanted to let our I want to let our listeners know what you went through, because I remember back then, this might be too much information for the listeners, but how much money did you make per month when you were living in East Timor?
That's right. So, one thing I've noticed about you, Ed, over the years is that you remember details of my life better than me.
I remember you telling me back then, and I was like, "What? How much do you make?"
I think I pulled out. So actually, it was kind of my choice how much I made, but I made, I believe, $150 a month. Does that sound right?
Yeah, that's about right. I think it was something like 5,000 or 6,000 baht a month, something like that. It was quite.
Yeah, I
remember you telling me, and I was like, wait, did I hear that correctly?
Yeah. I mean, but, I also didn't leave the island of Timor for like a year and a half, so
right.
I had to extend my visa a couple times. So I went to West Timor, which is a part of Indonesia, and then crossed back over, but didn't leave the island. But yeah, I mean, that was like, it seems to me that if you're trying to get something started somewhere, you got to sort of be there and, stay in the place. And, while I learned Teton, which is the language there, I'm not Timorese, never going to be Timorese, not pretending that I sort of became Timorese in some way. That said, the more you can kind of understand the constraints and choices people make, the more you can understand where they're coming from, where they might be going next, etc.
Sure. Now, we don't have to get into the details of your education, but you went from there to Princeton, and then you ended up in Africa. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. So I started, but did not finish a master's program at Princeton. And then I ended up with a job with the government of Liberia, working as a special assistant and then aid management advisor to the Minister of Finance there. And so,
cool.
So yeah, did that for a little bit, then went back, started a PhD, continued to do work while I worked on the PhD, places like South Sudan, a little bit of work in Somalia, etc. And basically, I now feel I've got, frankly, one of the best jobs in the world. I've got wonderful students at Johns Hopkins back in DC. I've got the ability to kind of think about a broad remit of things. Basically, if you had told me growing up in Detroit that there was a job that paid me to come up with questions that I thought were interesting to ask, go out and figure out if anyone had the answer to them, and then if they didn't, work to come up with an answer, I would have said, why does anybody... Why does this job exist? Why is that? Okay, I like it. Sounds awesome. Yeah. What's the job part of that?
Yeah, and, or where's the hook?
Yeah, exactly. And I feel super lucky, and and I'm here on sabbatical now, here through the new year, basically, as you know, with an affiliation with Thammasat, the university you're also affiliated with, and doing some research here in Thailand.
I'm going to translate a little bit of that. Basically, what Dan does is he tries to figure out what kind of aid or help maybe wealthier countries can give less developed countries. So is that about right? I mean, you're trying to figure out what works and what doesn't work. Is that a quick, short way to put it?
So I think about development assistance. I think about that aid, right? You were just talking about. I also think a lot about sort of management practice, which I know sounds super exciting to your listeners. I mean, if there's something people love talking about, it's management practice. But no, I mean, I think a lot about kind of where we want to give people more autonomy, more discretion, and what they do with that discretion. That's true both of the people who give out aid and the countries that receive it, right? So, the American government, or the Thai government for that matter, gives money to a developing country, right? That money flows through a program. How do we set up that program? Who should have control over what happens in that program? Once the money goes over to the developing countryside, what kind of strings should be attached? When are those good things? When are they not good things? And, mainly, basically, how do we improve...
Like the mechanics of the programs, right?
Yeah, how do we improve welfare by thinking about how do we make stuff better for people? By figuring out what the right way of kind of setting up the pipe is, right? So... a lot of people in the world who think about where the water's going, right? A lot of people in the world who think about where the water comes from. I'm interested in the interconnections. I'm interested in the piping in the middle.
Interesting. Well, let me get back to kind of where the idea for this podcast came from. So, as our listeners know, I've been in Thailand a long time, and there's tons of stuff I love about this country, but things that frustrate me. And on my list of, idiosyncratic things that bother me is I've always been a little bit bothered when Thai people or my students refer to Thailand as a poor country. It's just always kind of bothered me a little bit because although I'm not an economist, I can read Wikipedia, and I've seen the list of the ranks, the UN's ranking of countries by GDP, and I know Thailand's around 24th or 25th in the world GDP. And out of roughly 200 countries, that's roughly in the top 10 or 15%. And I'm like, if you're in the top 10 or 15%, you're getting a B or B plus.
I like it.
So in my simplistic way, I'm like, how could this be a poor country? So can you just maybe elaborate on that? I'm sure there's a much more complicated way to figure out. What would your answer be if someone just asked you straight away, is Thailand a poor country? How would you answer?
I'd probably say no. Right? I'd probably say I don't think about Thailand as a poor country. I'm not sure Thailand's all the way up. I'd need to look up the number, but I'm not sure Thailand's all the way up at 24th or 25th. But Thailand is definitely an upper middle income country. So, if you think about it as kind of rich countries, poor countries, middle income countries, the international system, World Bank, IMF, then classify those in the middle, right? And Thailand's in the upper part of the middle group. So they're not in the rich kids club, but neither are they a poor country by any means. Neither is it a poor country by any means.
I commend you on the straight answer, which from academics can sometimes be hard to get.
Yeah, Ed told me before the podcast that I shouldn't be an academic in responding as an academic. So doing my best.
He's doing great. Straight answers. We love straight answers.
Thank you.
Here on the Bangkok podcast. So back in the day, I remember when I was in school, we talked about first world countries, second world countries, third world countries, and then somewhere along the way, I feel like it maybe had been in the 90s. I just got the feeling that those terms had become passé. Do you guys still use those words or not?
Yeah, not really. And, to be honest, those terms so I'm not an expert on this, but my understanding is that those terms came actually from politics, not from economic development, right? So the first world was kind of the club that was aligned with America and the West and markets. The second world, which we almost never talked about, right, was the communist world.
Oh, okay.
And the third world were those who weren't really fully part of either world, right?
Maybe like a non-aligned or, I understand.
Yeah, the non-aligned countries, non-aligned movement.
So it really wasn't about development per se.
No, it wasn't, but I think it actually points up something kind of interesting, which is that people have, for a very long time, been thinking about the developing world as a residual category. The third world's just defined as those that aren't part of the first world.
Right,
the second world.
They're the leftovers.
They're the leftovers. And in the same way, when people think about the developing world, it often is kind of it's like most people in most countries, but in some kind of logical sense, it's also kind of those that are left over after we carve out the parts that are developed, right?
Right.
It's bigger, but it's the leftover part, right?
Right.
It's the, the large part of the cake you didn't eat when you first sat down,
Yeah, right.
And thus it's residual. And
So far I feel like you've made clear that Thailand is not really poor. It's somewhere in the middle, maybe upper middle in the world. But my second question, which and this has come up before on the podcast, is of course everyone knows Thailand is pretty unevenly developed, and one of my favorite insights into Thailand came early on in this country when a friend of mine said to me, "We don't live in Thailand, we live in Bangkok." Yeah. And I was like, "What do you mean?" And then he was like, "Dude, have you been outside Bangkok? It's totally different." He's like, "Bangkok is really its own country." So I wondered about your insights. Like, when you're looking at a country, obviously you're looking at the evenness of development. That has to be a factor. So
sure.
So even though in general we have to put Thailand in the middle, what about Isan, or what about outside of Bangkok?
Okay, so first, I just want to draw an analogy to the developed world, right? So when I was in East Timor, since we talked about Timor, at one point I was talking to my aunt, right, who is from Brooklyn, right? Brooklyn, part of New York City, and my cousin was moving from Brooklyn to North Carolina, right, for a job. And, my aunt was saying, it's going to be tough for him. It's going to be tough living outside New York City. But then you know about that. And I said, what do you mean? And she said, well, you live outside New York City too, right? So, and I said, yeah, I guess that's true.
East Timor, North Carolina.
Hey, there are two categories. Yeah, one category is New York City, and it's got divisions like Brooklyn and Queens and the Bronx. And then, there's not New York, and then there's North Carolina and East Timor and Bangkok and things like that, right? And so, just to say, there are a lot of New Yorkers, I would say, my family being originally from New York, who can't imagine a world outside the city, right? Who
sure.
think of America the same way your friend talking about Bangkok was talking about Bangkok relative to the rest of Thailand, right? Does that mean that I'm suggesting that people in Kansas have a similar situation to people in Isan in the northeast of Thailand? Not at all. That's not what I'm suggesting. I'm just saying that how much people are place-based and how broad their universe is and how much that maps onto an actual country is, to me, not a Bangkok problem. It's not a Thailand problem. It's kind of like a human being problem.
It's like So it's more of like just an urban rural thing. Certainly, it's not unique to Thailand.
Yeah, right? Or imagine communities, imagine lives,
right.
Imagine worlds. Right.
But I mean, I'm guessing that when development people are in Thailand, I'm sure they're based in Bangkok, but they're not trying to fix Bangkok, right? I mean,
yeah. In fact, there's very little. So if by development people you mean people who work for kind of like international development organizations, World Bank, UN, places like that, not a lot of that work happens in Thailand. So Thailand has a big development community presence because it serves as a regional hub for countries in the region. But there are a lot of groups that have no Thai program at all anymore. But to the question that you asked, right? So Thailand's $2 a day poverty rate, Thailand's $1.90 poverty rate is less than 1%.
So I guess what I'm curious is when you see the inequality between Bangkok and the rest of Thailand, is that inequality in itself a problem, or do you just maybe say, okay, this is just the way Thailand is, or this is Thai culture, or is it from a development standpoint, is it automatically a problem?
I don't think it's automatically a problem in the sense that I think there are people who would disagree about how much we should think it's a problem, right? So inside the development community. So, I would say that the last, 5 or 10 years has seen a refocus on inequality as a problem in its own right, both in the developed and the developing world. But, the question comes down to a little bit, as you obviously know I'm going to go, to Arkansas and John F. Kennedy. So
okay.
That is to say, to the phrase "a rising tide raises all the boats," right? Which was, to my knowledge, first uttered by Kennedy in Heber Springs, Arkansas, when giving a speech about a pork barrel project, which, as you know, Ed, is a project where basically the idea is it's been done because, it benefited somebody.
Right.
And, it benefited somebody politically. And Kennedy said, look, people say, why did we build this dam in Arkansas? Why are we paying attention to Arkansas? Well, we're paying attention to Arkansas. We built this dam in Arkansas because if people in Arkansas are richer, they're going to buy more cars from Detroit, right? What helps Arkansas doesn't just help Arkansas. It helps Arkansas. It helps Detroit. It helps the whole country. A rising tide raises all the boats.
Interesting. And so, of course, I knew that expression, but I did not know where it came from. Now I do know. Thank you.
Yeah. My students are subjected to a bad Kennedy impersonation in class on an annual basis. Actually, I think I gave it up this year. I think there was somebody from Boston, and I felt too embarrassed to do it. But yeah. So the question is, how badly is the bottom doing, and are things getting better for the bottom in addition to getting better for the top, right? So is, to me, kind of, at least for myself, the central way I would ask the question. And so, in some ways, Thailand's absolute poverty has gone so far down that now nobody is extremely poor. About 10% of people in the world live on less than $1.90 a day, right?
Okay.
Adjusted poverty, right? That number in Thailand is basically zero, right?
Okay. So basically what you're saying is Thailand really doesn't have desperately poor people.
Right. So, but being just above desperately poor doesn't mean your kids are not going to have stunting, right? It doesn't mean it certainly doesn't mean your kids are going to have access to adequate education, right?
Right.
So, Thailand, it's a little bit tricky because Thailand has a poverty line. Thailand's poverty line is, I think, at like $7 a day, something like that.
Okay.
And about, I think it's 7% of people are below that number, right? Okay. Numbers approximately that. I could look them up if you'd like.
Okay.
And so, but, basically, the bottom has done substantially better over the last 25 years.
Okay.
There are still very, very poor people. Much of my research here in Thailand focuses on Isan, right? And certainly there is what I would consider real poverty there. It's still not the same as a country where the average person is that poor, and there are such countries.
Okay, so it looks like the bottom of Thailand is doing okay compared to the worst places on earth, basically.
Yes.
Okay, but what about this? So we talked about this on the podcast before, and it was a big news story this year, and I can't remember where the article was published, but the headline was literally Thailand is the most unequal country in the world. And the data is a little bit unclear. I would say, according to their numbers, Thailand's really in the top 5. But they were using just one way to measure inequality. And the measure was the percent of a country's entire wealth that is in possession of the top 1%. And I don't have the number right in front of me, but I think it was around 60% or 65%. So Thailand's wealthiest 1% have something like 60 or 65%, and that put Thailand in the top 5. So it's very top heavy. So even if Thailand is not poor, as you say, that seems to be a pretty good definition of unequal.
Sure. Look, there, as you implied in the question, there are lots of ways of defining inequality. So I think the kind of like standard international way of thinking about it is this thing called the Gini coefficient, which basically thinks not just about the top 1%, but about the whole distribution of wealth and who has it. And on those measures, I think Thailand does reasonably poorly. Poorly like America poorly, right?
Which but better, not in the top 5 worst.
Not in the top 5, not in the top 10. I'm pretty sure not in the top 20 worst.
Yeah, if I remember correctly, it's around 40 or something, which is relatively close to the U.S.
Yeah. So that so if the question is that one way of defining inequality? Answer, sure. Yeah. Both those are ways of defining inequality. I could imagine uses for which we might want to think about the top 1%. So, for example, if we moved over to kind of thinking about political economy questions and what elites want, it strikes me that thinking about the very small group at the top makes even more sense, because we can imagine that those who are...
Right, along with that extreme wealth, relative extreme wealth, and absolute extreme wealth, probably comes political power.
Exactly. And probably comes interests that differ from most other people in your country. And, I of course, am thinking here in the background about the 99% movement in America.
Sure.
I mean, is the question, is that inequality a problem? Then, at the risk of sounding like an academic, the follow-up question is, for whom and for what, right? So if you're asking me, for a development person, is it a problem? To me, the part of that question where you ask for a development person doesn't have a lot of content. What I mean by that is, like, is that a problem? I think it's a problem in America.
Right. But it would probably really... So what you're kind of saying, it really depends on what that top 1% is doing with their money or what they want. Like, you could imagine some enlightened elite that was doing the right things with that money, and then in that case, it wouldn't be a problem.
Maybe.
But
there's also an argument that...
Sounds like a fantasy, though. That sounds like a fantasy.
There's also an argument that any use of that money... So my buddy Anand Giridharadas wrote this book, which I highly recommend. I think we actually talked about it a few months ago. It's a book called Winners Take All, which basically argues...
Right. We did talk about that.
Yeah, it basically argues that even if rich people give away their money, they're still doing it in a way that kind of changes social policy, that influences things in a way that, even if they have the best intentions of the world, reflects their understanding of what justice should look like, which probably people who have benefited from a system are not the people most likely to wish to overturn the system they benefited from, not merely because of like material self-interest, but also because they probably we all believe that the things we've gotten in life are because we worked hard, because the system was fair, etc.
So again, I don't want to force you into straight answers on everything, but by that analysis, then maybe that gross inequality of the 1%, maybe that is just, we should just look at that and say it's bad.
If you're asking me, Dan Honig, do I think that's a bad thing? Yes, I think that is a bad thing. If you're asking me, is that a problem for development as seen by the universe of development practitioners, at the risk of sounding like I'm wiggling, I can't say that, because too big groups. And there are plenty of people in the world who would say, in the development community, who would say, look, what we care about is making sure everyone has enough to eat and access to healthcare, right? These questions about distribution are political questions which are not the purview of development.
And Thailand's doing at least okay on the everyone has food and everyone has okay healthcare. They're at least doing okay.
And actually on the healthcare side, I mean, Thailand's life expectancy, I think, is probably even above the trend line for its income per capita. The 30 baht scheme, which is the kind of basic public health scheme here in Thailand, as you well know, is, I think, a real model for the world, actually. A flawed model that has problems, but Thailand, if the opportunity to live a long and healthy life in which one does not need to worry about starvation is what we are mainly concerned about, Thailand is doing pretty darn well for the vast majority of its citizens, and even pretty good for the people who are not part of that vast majority.
Okay, I guess I can tell my students to stop whining about how poor Thailand is.
Well, look, I mean, it all depends. All depends who you're compared to. So I can't remember the source of this. This is potentially, you can write this up as apocryphal, but I think I read somewhere that like a study of people in the top 1% in Europe, or maybe it was in America, found that the majority of people in the top 1% compared themselves unfavorably to people above them rather than favorably to people below them. Right? So, like, if you think about them, they're like way higher than the upper middle income of their countries.
Right.
But they still are looking, if up is wealthier, they're still looking north on the list and not south, right?
Yeah.
And like, I think there's just a kind of human that in some cases is just a kind of quite positive thing that we're a striving
Yeah, it could be that could be positive, right? You always want to do better.
Yeah, so I was recently part of a policy process where somebody was saying that no one does this well, and in a written document, and I said, look, I don't think I agree that no one does it well. I do agree that everyone could do better, right? And that kind of focus on improvement is a great thing. That said, it also means that even relatively wealthy places, relatively wealthy countries, relatively wealthy people, I think, have a tendency to look north in this. If you think about sort of the comparison with America, us both being Americans, right? Like, Thais getting visas to America versus Americans getting visa to Thailand, as you know far better than me, and I bet you've talked about on this podcast at some point, totally different stories, right?
Sure, absolutely.
I just show up at the airport, they put a stamp in, not right now because I'm here longer term, but
Right.
Anyone can do that. Whereas, Thais trying to get a visa to America, I mean,
can be difficult for sure. It definitely can be a pain.
And why is that? Well, because one country is worried about the citizens of the other country and not vice versa, right?
Right.
And in that sense, to say Thailand's not a poor country is not to say that if your club of rich countries looks like Germany, Austria, France, the UK, US, Australia, that all those countries see Thailand as a kind of kindred country. And that's true even in, so OECD, which is the richest of rich kids clubs,
right.
nationally speaking, Mexico is a member of the OECD.
Right.
Mexico is a developed country, according to one of the, I think, most plausible answers to what constitutes a developed country.
Right.
Most Americans don't think
you're
that.
right. I think we were talking about this, and I'm not going to reveal my salary on the show because I consider it fairly paltry, but I think you and I were talking that my salary probably puts me in the top 1 or 2% in the world, which is kind of insane.
Yeah.
I mean, it's back to what you were saying, that almost everyone kind of feels not necessarily poor, but kind of disadvantaged, or everyone feels that they're not doing well. Even if on an absolute level, you're like in the top 1% in the world.
Totally. I actually, when I lived here in Thailand, so we talked about my salary in Timor. When I first moved to Thailand, I want to say my salary was 15,000 baht a month. So at the time, $375. I think now it'd be about 500, but exchange rate differences, whatever. So I'm making $400 a month, right? I'm feeling pretty poor, right? And at some point I said this to one of my Thai colleagues. Again, I worked at a nonprofit, a wonderful organization called Ashoka, worth looking into for any of your listeners. And I said this to one of my colleagues, and they said, that makes you one of the richest people in Thailand. I mean, I know you have a university degree. I graduated from University of Michigan. Seemed like a great guy, but just to be clear, you are making what, by Thai standards, is a pretty darn good salary. And I looked it up, and I think at the time, 15,000 baht put me in the top 5%, but not the top 1%, if I remember right.
Right.
And I actually put that on my door here in Bangkok, right? I lived in one room in Phra Khanong, for those of you who live here in Bangkok.
Right.
Sukhumvit Soi Jetsi Bet, 71.
Yeah.
And, lived in one room. Often felt like I couldn't do things that other expats were doing. But on my door, I had a Post-it note that said, you are in the top 5% in this country. And that's before we ignore the fact that I could go somewhere else and make a heck of a lot more.
Right.
That's before we ignore material wealth, opportunity, the fact I could come here. The fact I knew I wasn't trying to make money over this period of my life, right? And I found that...
this reminds me of just what I've learned in Thailand, that, and I know this is a cliche to say travel broadens your mind, but I think until I left the U.S., I didn't realize how lucky I was until I left the U.S. and did some traveling.
Yeah, man, I totally agree. I mean, Rudyard Kipling, the English author, once said, "No man knows England who only England knows," which is, I suppose, a fancy way of saying what you just said. That until you can compare things, we all learn by comparison, right?
Right.
We all learn by comparing ourselves, by thinking about ourselves. That's the source of some of the problems we were talking about before too, in terms of, who you frame in and who you frame out of your group. And I think that's right. I think to me, one of the kinds of poverty I find most sort of frustrating in some ways is poverty of the imagination, right? So that is to say, look, we do not have a global system that gives everyone equal opportunity to get access to food, to get access to education, to get access to formal opportunity. But often, I think people limit themselves, right? If you think about that, work in Timor in some ways, right? I think often people limit themselves because of what they imagine could be possible, right, in the world. And that's true both when we compare ourselves north and when we compare ourselves south. And I think a kind of better understanding of a broader range of people and places and how they work and how they think can't help but to kind of increase tolerance and make the world a better place.
I have a feeling that our listeners will relate to that, since this is an expat show, so hopefully they will get the message. Well, anyway, that's about all the time we have for this interview, but rest assured, I do have many other questions about the Thai economy, so I probably will be asking you back on, Dan, so I hope you enjoyed yourself.
Very kind.
I want you to come back.
Well, we'll see. We'll see if your audience agrees. We'll see.
Right.
We'll see what we'll see what the people say. And thanks so much. Always great chatting with you. The first time in front of microphones, but
that's right.
Really enjoy it. And thanks so much for having me on. Thanks to your listeners if you've listened to this. If you have any thoughts, questions, etc., I'm easy enough to find. danhonig.info is my website. I don't know.
All right, cool.
We'll
have a link to Dan's website. So if you have any economic development related questions, especially about Thailand, he'll be happy to answer.
Fantastic. Or any other things about which I'm not an expert. The
Right.
sport of kabaddi, which I recently saw a tournament of for the first time here in Bangkok, or I'm sorry, here in Thailand. It was in Krabi. Many other things. Nautical history, other questions
right.
I can answer.
He knows a lot about Detroit sports too, so I need
It's
Detroit
true.
sports
It's
questions.
true. If you have any questions, particularly about the Tigers of the mid '80s, those are questions very much up my alley. Thanks, Ed. Thanks for having me on.
All right, thank you, Dan.
Man, I wonder what it's like to be that smart. Like, I've always wondered.
Yeah, he's such a fascinating guy to talk to. I was teasing him when we were doing the interview that he had to give me like short answers. And with guys like him, he's got so much experience. He teaches all these different classes. He's read so many books that it's like you ask him like one question, and then like 35 minutes later, he's like still answering it.
You're like I haven't understand 15 of the past 30 words he said. That was really cool though. It was some good insights, and the dude has a lot of experience. I mean, if a lot of Westerners might think of Thailand as a poor country, but Dan has worked in some poor countries, like really poor countries. So it really gives him a unique perspective and an interesting comparison when it comes to talking about Thailand.
I think that's an excellent point, because it's just that perspective, So it's like when I told him when I wanted to talk about whether Thailand is a poor country, he was just like, "It's not a poor country." You know what I mean? It's just like in his perspective, like what he's used to dealing with, it's like Thailand is on a whole nother level. It's got
Right.
issues, and obviously there are parts of Thailand that are very poor, but it's just he's dealing with countries that just have a whole bunch of different problems that Thailand is well beyond.
Well, really interesting stuff. And I like the fact that we're starting to get more like professionals and experts on about certain things too. And we've got another economist who's a specialist in labor economics coming on in a couple of weeks. So she's going to give us some more insights into that side of Thailand. So I think we're really cracking open the Thailand nut.
That's right.
On season 4.
Because we're smart enough to know we're not smart. So that's why we have these experts on.
That's what Shaquille O'Neal says, right? They're like, how do you become so good at business? And he's like, I'm not good at business. I just pay people to be good at business for me.
That means
seriously, that's what he said. He's like, just hire smart people.
But that means he's good enough at business to know to hire good business people, huh?
Right. He's good enough to know that he's dumb, just like us.
That's great. That's great. All right, so let's get into some love, loathe, or live with, where one of us picks a particular aspect of living in Bangkok, which we then discuss and decide if it's something we love about living here, loathe about living here, or have come to accept as something that we have to learn to live with, no matter how we feel about it. This week, it is Greg's turn.
Yeah, well, I was trying to think of a bunch of stuff, and I couldn't really think of anything, so I decided to go with something really, really simple. Ed, what do you think about fresh coconuts? Some guy chops the top off, sticks a straw in, you drink the juice.
This is good. I think this is good, especially coming up with it off the top of your head. I got to go thumbs up. I've got a few other points to make, though. So I'd love the idea of fresh coconut. I think it's definitely healthy. And so I like the idea that in Thailand, especially, it does seem to be more prominent, like near the beaches, but you can still snag this on Bangkok streets, right?
Yeah. Shopping malls, supermarkets.
Depending on where you are. I got to go thumbs up. I like that when I first was exposed to this, I thought it would taste like super coconutty, which I'm not that crazy about. But actually, coconut water, it obviously tastes a little bit like coconut, but it's more like fresh water. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's not like super. It's not like some super strong flavor. It's just
it's got like a whiff of coconut on it.
Yes, and it's a little bit sweet, and I do think it's healthy. But here's my but. I think that like coconut water in bottles and is just kind of overhyped. I don't think it's some kind of like magic elixir, like super fruit solution. I think it's basically like water with some vitamins and minerals in it. You know what I mean?
Right. Yeah. I surprisingly, I'm a live with. Like, I'll eat it, I'll drink it, if it's there, and I'll enjoy it. But I would never say, man, like, ooh, I have a craving for coconut water. So I would never go out of my way to eat it.
Yeah, I kind of agree. I feel like I'm a little bit more than a live with. Like, I do kind of like it. I don't know if I'd say love, but it is just a cool thing that I can't remember ever seeing it in the States. I'm sure it's available somewhere in the States, but it's not like frequently available. You know what I mean?
Right. And if it's probably $26, but here it's like, 15 baht for coconut.
Yeah. It's just kind of cool that you can get something so fresh.
Yeah.
So I'm gonna go love.
All right. I'm going to go live with. I like it, but I'm not going out of my way to find out.
Gotcha. So as Greg mentioned at the beginning of the show, we'd like to say thank you to Mark Fukuda for lending us his support at the show shoutout level. So Greg, what did you find out about Mark?
Well, I had to, this one's a bit of a stretch, but as it turns out, Mark is another one of our patrons who prefers radio silence. I sent him 2 emails, nothing. But I did some digging online, as I am wont to do, and one of the most popular posts about quote Mark Fukuda in Google is a post titled "Whatever Happened to Mark Fukuda and His Yellow Chevy Blazer?" Now it turns out that Mark Fukuda anyway, was a big car guy back in the day, but he disappeared from the circuit, from the scene, without telling anyone what was going on, hence the update in this blog about whatever happened to Mark Fukuda and his yellow Chevy Blazer. But of course, I put on my conspiracy hat and I followed some leads that make me believe that Mark is actually following in the footsteps of Nash Bridges. Do you remember this TV show, Ed?
I do remember it. I don't know much about it, but I do remember it.
Man, I loved it. Nash Bridges was a Don Johnson cop show from the early 90s. It didn't do too well, but I loved it. I thought it had style galore. I thought it was great. And beyond his love of clothes, Nash Bridges, the character of Nash Bridges, also loved, get this, his yellow Plymouth Barracuda, which is a badass muscle car.
Yeah, it is, sure.
They're great. They're beautiful. And Barracuda just so happens to rhyme with Fukuda.
Interesting.
And don't you know it, that particular style of Barracuda that Nash Bridges drove can fetch over $1 million on the open market these days. So I think Mark is hiding his sweet yellow ride in Thailand somewhere, biding his time until he can safely put it on the market and maximize his profits, which is a good strategy.
Muscle cars, that's just something you don't see a lot of in Thailand.
That's a very good point. And when you do see one, I mean, I know nothing about cars except I know what looks cool. But when you do see one, it's like, holy shit, did you see that car? Like, they are rare and they are nice.
That's right. Agreed.
So, Mark, if you're here with your Barracuda, Mark Fukuda and his Barracuda. I hope you're enjoying it, man. Thank you for the support, dude. And send us an email if you're around, if you're out there somewhere. It'd be nice to hear back from you.
Thanks, Mark. We appreciate it. All right, a final thanks to our patrons who help keep the show ad-free. Patrons get a ton of cool perks and the warm, fuzzy feeling knowing that they're helping support the show. Find out more by clicking support on our website. And connect with us online. We're Bangkok Podcast on social media, bangkokpodcast.com on the web, or simply bangkokpodcast@gmail.com. We love hearing from our listeners, and we always reply to our messages.
Yeah, you can also listen to each episode on YouTube, or check this out, Ed. We have over 300 subscribers now, which is pretty cool.
Nice.
Yeah. You can chat with us online, or even reach out to me directly on Twitter, where I am BKK Greg. So thank you for listening, everyone, and we'll see you back here next week.
See you next week.
No, but the air is back up to really crappy levels now.
Yes. It really changes fast, doesn't it, man? It literally depends on which way the wind's blowing. Kind of like
It literally does. Yeah.
Kind of that old expression. Depends on which way the wind's blowing.
Back when I had hair, I used to hate the wind, like loathe it. But now I really quite enjoy it.